Well, hey, everybody. Time for another public journal by one Curtis Cobb. I don't know why my clock does that on my computer. It is 9:08 a.m. on Saturday, September 28th. Fun idea for a journal today. Dad, what happens when we die? My 8-year-old daughter and I go on walks in the morning and the night, 1 mile with our dog. And recently that question came up. And I wasn't quite ready to answer it. I knew it was coming, but I think in the moment, pretty happy with what I said, but it wasn't complete enough. It wasn't full enough. And I'm always getting my subconscious to sort of peruse things I say and suggest like clarification and follow-up that I think would be useful later. And that happened today. My kid and my dog and I were at the park, and my daughter made a comment about waiting on the dog and how walks are boring. And I was trying to justify them as well as a moment away from your tablet or constant entertainment is what the walk is for. It's for us to have this conversation where we talk about big stuff that it wouldn't have occurred to us to talk about otherwise. It's a chance to experience a now together and be fully there and without all the distraction. And it's kind of an adventure, we're going somewhere and we don't have a car. And who knows what our dog will do? Will there be other dogs that cause problems with ours? The whole thing, I think, is a really healthy practice that I'm telling her is not optional. Like, for your life, we're going to be doing this, kid. And it's good for you, and it's good for me, and it's good for our dog. And she made a comment. I said, I can't remember exactly how it happened, but she was like, I said, well, we have to wait. We'll always have to wait for Max. And she was like, well, not after he's gone. And that kind of brought back the conversation we'd had. And right then, my dog decided to take a dump in the park and scooped it up in a bag. And I said, well, here, you take this to the garbage can. You're the one who loves the dog and insists that we keep him. I have a golden, that's a tangent. So that means you share some of the burden of this. Now, take the bag. I did the hard part and go throw it in the garbage. And so she went to the dispensary of that, and me and Max kept walking along, and I'm thinking about our last conversation about the topic, that big, heady topic of what happens when we die, Dad. This is what I think. And she told me. And I journaled that. I can't recall it exactly right now, so I won't describe it. It's very, 8-year-old daughter. 8-year-old's understanding. Sort of composing with things she'd heard here and here and here, and doing her best in the moment like an adult does, honestly. Just we're drawing from more context. So when she got back up to me and Max, I said, well, hey, that's it. You just mentioned an important thing that we never really, one time we were talking about that. We never really finished it. You want to talk about it? And she kind of gave me one of those, okay, here's my philosopher dad going to tell me stuff again. And I never want it to be like a dad-splaining. I never want it to be like this is what you should believe, kid. That's a really core part of my cognitive as a father that I'm trying to foster. I really want to say, well, it's up to you to figure these things out in your own cool flavor. That's jumping ahead, but that's a lot of what I think this is for. So I said, I never really answered that question for you for what I think. And so, kiddo, all of us are just doing our best to make a guess at that question. So here's my guess. After 46 years of trying to answer it by listening to my dad and my mom and the kids at school and the kids at work in second childhood. So I said, I look at all of this as training. It's really very popular today to think or to say nothing happens. This is all an accident. You're meant to endure as comfortably as you can if you're fortunate, and then it's over. And for no purpose. It's just you're part of a bigger machine that if any human tells you they understand, they're either trying to sell you something or control you or just take advantage of you in a malevolent way. That's sort of popular dogma right now is atheism, and it's that view, basically. All of this is pointless. And religion, quote unquote, because a lot of people in the United States grew up with Christianity of some flavor or Catholicism, something like that. And they come to the conclusion, especially in these times we live in, that all of that is kind of bullshit that somebody's using to take advantage of you. And they're not to be trusted. And importantly, they're not to be studied because they don't make any sense. And it's cavemen came up with that. And then they said, God did it, told me. Now, imagine telling your kid that. and not even thinking the impact that it would have on your child. I find I'm always looking at impacts to my parenting years out. Like, what is the impact of telling my 8-year-old it's all pointless? When it's over, it's blackness and you just cease to exist anymore. What a way first to just like murder her creativity. I would say like right at that point, right when you tell your kid to do that with all of the dogmatic fervor of your Catholic parent telling you it was Adam and Eve and Noah and all of that you think's bullshit now. If you just, with all that dogmatic fervor, bake into your kid, it's all pointless. Don't study any of that, and don't try and solve these problems for yourself and come up with your own kind of cool flavor of them. Just try to be comfortable and survive until it all ends for no particular reason. I don't see her becoming ever like a writer or a philosopher or an artist of any kind. So fuck that. I'm not going to tell my kid that. It's awful. So what do you say? What in the past we used religion was our guideline. Like that was a story we composed with outside ourselves that was what people thought before us and answered and addressed these questions in a more nuanced, interesting way that fosters creativity and individuality. Not where you're just a sheep that thinks it's all stupid and nothing and I'm going to go buy a cooler car. How do you in 2024 as a parent, when all the kids basically think that, and they're unwilling to be open-minded and look into the past and then sort of take popular belief now, devoid of creativity or rich, nuanced insight, and couple it with all of the old. A thing I mentioned earlier is that almost everyone today thinks they understand what religion is because of the one or two flavors they were exposed to and the high level sort of kibitzing between those like in Western, this teachings, this would be like debates between a Muslim and a Christian. When that is not religion, that is a couple flavors. That's a couple paths that propagated really well over time. They had staying power because they worked for some of our ancestors. If you think about it, just like an engineer, in order for a cult or a religion or a thesis for what this is, answer questions of meaning, purpose, and what happens when I die and what happens to my loved ones when they die, those questions. There's so many different available interpretations. And if you're just looking at like two Western takes that are arguing with each other about whether it should be cool to drink or not, or because one path, or eat pork or not, or I'm just looking at those two and choosing, importantly, not to take a side because that's just such a small sliver of the whole pool of ideas about this. You really have to go look at Hinduism and Buddhism, and you got to look thoroughly at what they are, how they work, how they answer specifically these questions, methodologies, meditation, contemplation, all these things that you get in Eastern philosophy, breathing techniques like pranayama. You have to understand those things, or when you make like when Bill Maher makes or Richard Dawkins make a very sort of, I would say, not at all humble, global dismissal of all religion as bad and a thing they understand better than the religious. If you didn't study that, like if you didn't study the rich diversity of thought of East and Western philosophy and spirituality, then you have no clue what religion is, because you're only looking at this tiny cross section that's very similar. Like I would say Western faiths are all structured around this: follow our manual or perish. Like there's no way to individuation and understanding this experience you're riding in unless you follow our strict doctrine. Do it our way, child, and don't think freely for yourself. Whereas the Eastern schools are kind of this sort of attuning yourself to the interconnectedness of everything and trying to sort of optimize for kind of riding in the slipstream of everything, and then letting it sort of guide your subconscious and cultivating compassion by default as like highest virtue, to where in a moment you're sort of immune to anger, and it's way less rigid in its doctrine, especially in Buddhism as opposed to Hinduism. Like Buddhism is an offshoot of Hinduism that makes it sort of culturally accessible to diverse cultures and takes all the practice around like building mantras to condition how you think in real time in a more compassionate way, for example. Now, I never hear, like the other day I saw Jordan Peterson on the Bill Maher podcast, and I was curious, and I don't watch a lot of Bill Maher anymore because I find his worldview so dogmatic, and he's completely locked himself out of the ability to consider broad, because he's sure he already knows everything, and everybody but him is smart. I'm sorry if that's a miscategorization, Bill, but I've never heard you talk seriously about Hinduism or Buddhism and compare and contrast the two philosophies. And speaking of philosophy, reaching into like Greek and Roman philosophy that are outside of religion that are sort of analytical exploration of thought and being that are also not rigid, but are very sort of, they're very rational in how they look at how sense making works and how you, for example, as a Stoic, learn to not focus any of your emotional and your thought time on things that are entirely out of your ability to influence or exert an impact on outcome. Like, he always just goes to, oh, this metaphor in the Bible I didn't understand about Adam and Eve. I mean, he takes it literally, and so does Dawkins, as how's it possible that we ever sprang from, and this ridiculous story about taking a rib out as Adam. Now, if you look at that as a metaphor for a sort of subconscious and conscious mind, masculine and feminine interpretations, where masculine is like, here's an idea, very focused, analytical, rational, and feminine is like, I accept your idea. That makes a lot of sense. And it inspires me to love you. Or it creates this rich emotion in me to hear your masculine assertion. And then if you go look at biology and nature, you see that there's these unisex critters that are at the base of our story, of our, like, if you look into the trees and the dogs and the bees and the humans, you go far enough down into our lineage and we all think of this sort of like chemical soup somewhere that where a spark of life occurred and it just emerged. Well, and then you look at bacteria and you look at all these things, and eventually you get to this place where there's this fork of biological life that is divergent from the unisex biological life, bacterial or whatever, however you define these things. And suddenly they were able to think of themselves as male and female and to diversify their collective source code, let's call it, or just biological structure, like the formula we use to make a me through our variations in DNA, coupled with our unique life experience, creates very unique perceptions. And if you look at the base code of that, there had to be a decision where the planarium or the whatever, the sexless being decided, I'm going to try this. I'm going to try diverging into a masculine and feminine polarity and then begin copulating to create ever new rich complexity. Whereas before I was just, on a single path. Now I can be so much more. And the tree of life grows. Well, that is a good way to look at a lot of what you read in, like, even the Western faiths. And I'm not familiar with the Quran. I've never read it. I just have a really good friend that I watched who grew up as a strict Muslim. And then he did what we're all doing now and embraced it's pointless. I don't want to say that, but he definitely pushed back against the insistence of his parents and his culture to believe a strict doctrine for answering these questions. And he started thinking for himself. Atheism is a really good step in that journey. The problem is if you get trapped there, then you end up the host of the Bill Maher podcast where you're basically just shitting on everybody else's. That's so rude. I don't want to say that about him. I went to one of his comedy shows once when I was in my mid-30s. I've always liked the guy. And I don't mean to I don't really have an opinion about Dawkins. I've read summaries of his book, but I didn't read The God Delusion. But I mean, I didn't because I thought exactly the way they did until I was about 42. So that was a lot of necessary context for what I said next to my kiddo in the park a minute ago. I said this. I said, kiddo, here's what I think. This is all training. It's a bit like a big video game where we come here to learn important lessons we need for whatever a new stage looks like that we can't actually comprehend yet. Like, you don't get to go do it until you can believe it's possible, until you can see it, until you can go, okay, I understand sort of compassion by default for all that's around me. I understand my place in this as just sort of a segmented piece of a much bigger thing. And I told her, I didn't say it exactly that way. I tried to keep it a bit more simple, but the gist was, I bet you we can come back and do these as many times as we want. Nobody actually knows, including the people who say nothing happens. Mostly they say that because they can't imagine, and they've decided that it's wrong to try and think about what could be more. But if you really think about like reincarnation, and you study it carefully as a scholar, and you study the different, like the divergent paths and how like a Buddhist and a Hindu thinks about them and why, and the cultural relevance of, China, Japanese Zen, and, I forget the three major deities of Hindu faith. I think Shiva's one of them. Like, you really have to have all that context, even if you don't agree with it, in order to speak intelligently about it. Otherwise, you're just talking out of your ass. That's how I feel like I was most of my life. I was talking out of my ass. I didn't know. And I was sitting there going, I know exactly what you're all about. You devout, let's say, monk. Somebody who shaves their head, puts on the orange robes, and goes and lives in a, the life Siddhartha lived before he abandoned that path. It's so logical and rational to me, that part of me that was a software engineer my whole life, to think, no, this is a very useful thing happening here. And it's just so silly to me to think that we just throw it all out and it's meaningless. This takes a lot of compute. I think now, after having looked at all of that stuff, and with 46 years of experience, I think about it so much differently. I just think, yeah, this is obviously, like, when I think of how I looked at everything before I was a father versus now as a father, where I'm thinking of the impact of my words on my kids' development as a result of how I convey, like how I pattern not just how I think about these things, but how I parent. How I, like, my style is not to say, hey, think what I think, kid. No, it's very much, think what you think. I love that. I want to hear that. I want to hear that as it develops. I will love to sit and talk with you philosophically about these things for the rest of our lives. And maybe that goes on across lots of cycles, because it's just so fucking logical. I could see reincarnation working like, I'm going to come back and experience life as Curtis 1,000 times, 10,000 times. Who knows? Until I get all of the necessary ingredients. Like, maybe I've done it. If you believe in a multiverse, and as a physicist these days, if you're Michio Kaku, or who would be another one? Steve Carroll, I think is his name. Somebody Carroll, Sean Carroll. Then you have to be open to, and I think maybe he doesn't now. I don't know. String theory is kind of dying right now. You have to be open to a potential where that's true. And that means, yeah, maybe last go, I didn't have kids. And then when I got to the big lobby at the end, where I get to sort of review it all, look at what I learned, and decide for myself, I'm ready to do something beyond the human experience. I could look around at all of my, and I can imagine us being able to communicate with our parents in the place where we're all looking at our life reviews and sharing them with each other and going, I still don't, I haven't experienced what I needed to learn how to parent in a way that is the healthiest, because I skipped that on this pass. I just focused on myself and maybe being a popular, well-respected and loved comedian like Bill Maher, where I was very self-focused for the entire journey. But then, at the end, I could see sitting there talking with Bill Maher, because we're all on equal footing in that place outside of time. That's logical to me. And it's also logical to me that we don't forget context, that we would never, we don't just suddenly forget all this. I think we compare and contrast, and we learn from each other. I could see wanting to come back and then be forced into being a parent and not having it be all about me, so that I could learn how to teach this and describe this higher thought out, because that's what I'm optimizing for. That's what this journey is about for me, is trying to take all of this complexity and make it very accessible to what I think is our next iteration, our digital translation of soul. When I look into a future that's resonant with all of our past, and I try and figure out a way that we keep all of what we are in a productive way, in a connected string that rolls through this now. They're very complicated thoughts that we didn't talk about on this walk. But it makes sense to me. Maybe next time I need to come back as a grasshopper, because there's something at that level I missed that I didn't see until I had experienced this version of being Curtis. Now, the truth is, Richard Dawkins has no more proof than I do for his worldview. He's using a consensus mechanism that he made a book, and more people outside of him agree in this place where we've all forgotten. His view is more popular. Nobody really follows me or knows who I am. So if you make that your sole premise for valuing, if it's all about how other people interpret how you think about it, and you need that validation, then you kind of think you're done at that point. Or no, whatever comes after this, it's logical to me that one of the core requirements of experience so far is to get past that needing outside consensus to agree with how you think about these things in order to believe in them. That is Carl Jung's work on individuation. And I talk about it a lot because when I look down at the source code of myself, I see that as being critical. Like, I must have a solid grasp that lets me interact with everyone around me in a healthy way and draw inspiration from them. But critically, not need them to sign off on how I think. That's for me to decide. And I think until you mature to that point, you're still in second childhood. And it just makes so much sense to me. and that becomes my faith. Like when I listen to a Dawkins and a Marr and a pre-42-year-old Curtis reason this out, there's a logical fallacy. There's a fault, and that would prevent them from progressing until they had this wisdom that you really need to not need the approval of others. And you need to do that in a healthy way that's still compassionate, that lets you draw from their inspiration without, and continue to interact with them in a rich, cool way before you can move on to whatever's next, which I can't see. And if I could see it in that place between cycles, which start to just look like very analogous to waking consciousness and sleep. There's longer duration. It's like a bundle of those. Yeah, I see that I'd obviously need to be able to learn that lesson. And until I did, no progression forward would be possible. I would have to come, like, I would choose it in that place where it's perpetual bliss until it gets boring for me, or torment, if that's how I choose to. That was another thing that came up in our conversation, heaven and hell. My kid mentioned it, and I said, well, this is heaven for me. This is so interesting. Heaven and hell are just how they look to me, like how you choose to interpret the experience you're in a given moment, be it a dream, it's either, or a psychedelic experience, or just being her dad on that walk. Now, I could choose to take that as, oh man, it's hot out. It was hot out. I live in a hot place, and it's like 92 degrees, and it's hot. And my dog needs to go for somebody, like, he needs that mile. He's a golden retriever, 11-month-old golden retriever puppy. He needs that energy dump and that dump in the park, and he needs to go pee on everything out there. And I could look at that as like a chore, or I could look at it as a cool opportunity to have one of the most important conversations I'll ever have with my kid in her formative years, when she's past age 7, where she's learning to think about these things for herself. And I could choose to go, well, that's going to be one of the greatest memories of my life. When I look at the life review, I'm going to think of this walk and this, where I tried to communicate it out to let others have this. And I did my best to describe it. And that feels like heaven to me. It just feels like I'm already there. It's all perspective. Heaven and hell is perspective. If you look at whatever you're doing in the now as torturous, valueless, purposeless, and torment, then you're in hell. You don't need to worry about going there. You're already there. But you chose it in how you interpreted what was happening in the now. Whereas when I look at eternal being, I can see these forgetting cycles being so necessary. Like, when you can see it all suddenly, that would get boring. And you're going to want to forget it for a minute and go back and learn some new take. That's what this waking consciousness starts to feel like for me, and the dance between that and my dreams. Or I'm wrong about all that. And critically, that's where I went next with my kid. I said, I don't know. And anybody who tells you is doing their best to figure it out for themselves. And I think it's beautiful that you have your own way of looking at it that's changing. And I said, I remember very well being 8 years old. Even at 8, I felt like these adults don't realize how well I get what's going on. Like, I could tell the way my parents talked to me and the way adults would talk around me that they didn't quite figure out how much I was pulling from what they were saying, and how much they did not give me near enough credit for my cognitive ability at 8 years old. And I told her, I remember being 8 years old and thinking I was very smart and that I had it all figured out. And something that I've learned in the subsequent 38 years, or did you do math wrong on that? No, I did that right. Is I want to be a student. I want to be a kid forever. I don't want to, and I want to be one that's very open-minded about not having all the answers ever, and being sort of committed to that and loving the shit out of that idea. So, in 2024, in this time we live in, with my unique experience, that's how I address that question. And I feel like it opens up so much more potential for her to grow and evolve in cool ways that don't limit her and allow her to sort of foster creativity and have a path to rich artistic contribution, as opposed to, I don't know, some path where you go try and become an expert in some field and then compete in a materialistic way against other experts and try and vie for their affection and attention and acceptance, their rewards, their Nobel Prizes or their Oscars. I want her to want to do it for her because she's passionate about it, whatever it is. And I'm just going to love whatever she picks. It just seems so logical to me to do that. And our conversations will be so much cooler. I probably have a zillion other things to say on that, but yeah, today that's how I think about what happens when we die, what happens next. Prove me wrong. Fucking dare you. Cheers, everybody. Have a great however long it takes me to do this again. Bye.